She leaned in so close I could feel her breath on my cheek, her lips barely moving, her smile still stretched tight for her guests. And then I heard it. Quiet, sharp, and meant only for me. "Just act normal, Mom. You're embarrassing." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just looked at her, nodded like I understood, and turned back to the polished table in front of me. The silverware clinked gently against porcelain, the laughter around us soft and practiced, and the napkin in my lap twisted between my fingers like it might speak up for me. I stayed quiet. I chose peace. But later that evening, when dessert was served and the room was full of full bellies and hollow chatter, I reached into my purse. I felt something folded. And that's when I stood up, slowly, calmly, and read the note her own child had slipped into my bag without her knowing. "Before I go on, thank you for sitting with me. If you're still here, maybe you felt it too, that sting when someone you love makes you feel like too much or not enough. Tell me where you're listening from, if you can. Sometimes, knowing you're not the only one makes all the difference. I'm not telling this to blame or shame. I'm telling it because something inside me refused to stay quiet any longer. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't fight for a seat. It remembers who it is, even when others forget. So if you've ever been pushed to the edge of your own story, stay with me. Because what happened next, I'll never forget. I'm 71 now, though some days I feel like I've lived 3 lifetimes in one. I grew up in a quiet town where we knew the names of the mailman's kids and left our doors open in summer. Life wasn't easy, but it had a kind of rhythm to it. The kind that teaches you how to stretch a dollar, how to make stew last 3 nights, and how to smile through things nobody else sees. I didn't grow up with much, but I had hands that worked, a spine that wouldn't bend, and a heart that stayed soft even when life turned hard. I was 24 when I had my daughter, and not long after that, I found myself doing it alone. Her father left before she could speak his name. I didn't cry for long. I didn't have time to. There were mouths to feed, light bills to chase, uniforms to wash. I cleaned houses in the mornings, waitressed at night, and did laundry in between. I remember rocking her to sleep with tired arms, whispering stories while balancing an overdue envelope on my knee. She wasn't born with silver in her mouth, but I polished every spoon that fed her. I stitched every costume she wore to school. I scraped change from couch cushions to buy her birthday candles. I missed meals so she wouldn't have to. And when she'd run through the door waving a certificate or a drawing, saying, "Look what I made," I'd smile like I'd won a prize too. I never needed praise. I didn't raise her for a thank you. I raised her because that's what love does. It shows up, over and over, even when it's tired, even when it's alone. And maybe I thought that kind of love would plant roots so deep they'd never forget where they came from. But sometimes, even the strongest roots get covered up when people start building fences around the parts of you they no longer want to see. The invitation came in the mail, not a call, not even a voice note. Just a plain envelope with a printed card inside, clean letters spelling out the date, the time, the address. It was her handwriting, but it felt stiff, like I'd been invited to a meeting, not a gathering. At the bottom it said, "Please RSVP by Wednesday." No warm words. No "can't wait to see you, Mom." Just a formality. I held it in my hand for a while, reading it twice, then once more, wondering if she actually wanted me there, or just needed me to be. It became clear soon enough. She said the dinner was important. Her colleagues were coming, some higher-ups. She wanted the place to look balanced, she said. Put together. I remember her saying that word and how it sat in my chest like a stone. I wasn't being invited because she missed me. I was being placed like a prop in a family photo because I made her look respectable. She wanted me there to complete the picture, not to be part of it, and I said yes anyway. I spent the afternoon before the dinner slowly getting ready. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, brushing through my hair until it lay flat and soft. I reached for the navy blouse she once complimented years ago, back when compliments still felt like hugs and not rare coins. I ironed it 3 times, not because it was wrinkled, but because I didn't want to be. Not on her big night. Not in front of those people. I didn't want to give her any reason to look at me the way I'd seen her look at others who didn't quite fit the version of life she'd built for herself. I wore the necklace her father gave me the night she was born. It wasn't expensive, but it meant something. It had stayed in my drawer for years, but that night I fastened it slowly around my neck, almost like armor. I didn't expect it to protect me, but it helped me remember who I used to be. The girl who gave everything and the woman who never asked for anything in return. When I stepped out of the house, I told myself I wasn't going there for approval. I was going because sometimes love shows up even when it's not welcomed properly. Sometimes we still sit at tables that forgot how much we once carried just to make sure they stayed standing. The house was beautiful. Big, modern, the kind of place where the air feels filtered and the rugs look like nobody's ever walked on them. The walls were lined with quiet artwork and candles that flickered without scent, the kind you light not to warm the room, but to suggest that everything in your life is calm and curated. Her front door opened with a gentle chime, and the moment I stepped in, I could smell something expensive in the air. Not just the food, but the perfume of women who had somewhere to be after dessert, and the leather from shoes that had never touched wet pavement. She greeted me with a hug that didn't quite land. A quick smile, a nod toward the dining room, and a glance over her shoulder like she was checking to see who had seen us. I smiled, said thank you for the invitation, and followed her through the hallway into the room where everything had already been set. The table was long, too long for a family, just right for a performance. The plates were spotless, the napkins folded in those sharp little triangles, and the silverware lined up so perfectly it almost felt wrong to touch them. I stood there for a moment, letting it all in. Not in awe, but in awareness. The guests began to arrive one by one, polished and practiced, all with handshakes and cheerful tones. Her coworkers, she told me earlier, people from her office, some higher-ups. They made small talk in bursts, laughed too hard at small things, and sipped wine like it was a test of their posture. I sat at the far end of the table, close enough to see, but just far enough to be left out. I smiled politely, offered to help in the kitchen, and when the first round of food was served by a man in white gloves, I looked up at him and said, "You've got a steady hand. You'd have made a fine nurse." He chuckled softly, but from across the table I saw her eyes, a flicker, a pause. Later, as conversation moved into wine pairings and company travel perks, I tried to bridge the space. I told a light story about how she used to love peanut butter and banana sandwiches as a child, how she once cried when I cut them in squares instead of triangles. It was a small story, a tender one, meant to warm the room a little, but the laughter didn't come. Just a few polite smiles, and then her hand touched my arm gently. She leaned in close, not looking at me but past me toward the head of the table, and that's when she whispered it. "Just act normal, Mom. You're embarrassing." The words didn't rise, they slipped. They didn't sting right away, but sank slow like cold water soaking into fabric. I blinked. I didn't respond. Just looked down at my napkin, folded too tightly now in my hand, and let the silence wrap around me like a second skin. It's strange. You can survive childbirth, you can survive grief, poverty, betrayal, and loneliness. You can stand in the fire of decades without asking for anything in return. And still, somehow, a whisper, just 6 words, can drop you lower than all the rest. Not because of what was said, but because of who said it, and how much of your life you'd given to make sure their voice was never silenced. And now, there she was, silencing mine. I stayed quiet after that whisper. I didn't touch my food for a while, just moved it around my plate like maybe if I rearranged it enough, the silence would feel less sharp. The voices around me kept rising and falling like waves. Laughter from one end, clinking glasses from another, a toast I couldn't quite hear and wasn't meant to be part of. But while all of that swirled around me like I didn't belong to it, I felt something still. Something steady. And when I looked up, I saw him. Her son. Sitting across from me, not saying a word, not giggling like the others, not playing with his napkin or his fork. Just watching. Quietly, gently. Not with pity, but with something far heavier. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He just saw me. There was something in his eyes I recognized. Not the weight of knowledge, but the tug of understanding. That small flicker behind a child's gaze that says, "I don't know what's wrong, but I know something is." He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Children don't always need the details. They just feel what the heir won't say out loud. And the air at that table, despite all the polished silver and well-rehearsed stories, had shifted. He noticed before anyone else did. We had always had a quiet bond, he and I. Not loud or flashy. I never pushed myself into his world, just waited to be let in. And when he opened the door, I stepped through gently. I'd helped him with his school projects before, sitting beside him at the kitchen table while his mother rushed between work calls. He liked to draw things from books, real serious with his pencils, and I'd sit there handing him colors or cutting little bits of paper, just happy to be asked. Sometimes he'd come to me with his shoelaces untied or a snack he couldn't reach, and I never made him say please. He said it anyway, without being told. Respect isn't taught by force. It's grown in the spaces where you feel safe. At night when he couldn't sleep, sometimes I'd read to him. Not the quick kind of reading just to make a child doze off, but real stories, ones with meaning, with questions at the end. And sometimes he'd ask me things I wasn't ready for. Were you lonely when Mommy was little? Or did you cry when your mom died? I didn't always have answers, but I always answered anyway, because what matters most isn't getting it right, it's being real. He always listened, fully, deeply, like he was storing everything I said somewhere only he could reach. He didn't know everything. He couldn't have. But children, they smell sadness the way the earth smells rain before it falls. They sense when something is off, even when the adults are smiling too wide. And I think he sensed mine that night. Not the dramatic kind, not the loud kind. The quiet ache, the kind you carry beneath a blouse you iron 3 times. He didn't say a word, but I felt his presence like a hand held under the table, steadying me when my own had begun to shake. In that crowded room full of glasses and praise and people who barely noticed my name on the seating card, it was his stillness that reminded me I was not entirely invisible. Not yet. Dessert came out on trays so polished you could see the ceiling lights in the silver. Plates with tiny portions, dusted in powdered sugar and curled chocolate, were passed around like trophies. The laughter returned, this time a bit louder, maybe from the wine, maybe from the relief that dinner was almost over. I smiled, politely, nodded when someone made a comment I couldn't quite catch, and reached into my purse for a tissue. My eyes weren't watering, but my heart had been holding something heavy for too long. And sometimes a hand needs to do something simple just to feel steady again. My fingers brushed something unfamiliar, not the soft edge of a folded tissue, but a rougher corner, crinkled at the edge. I paused, frowned slightly, then pulled it out slowly beneath the table. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded twice, the kind you tear from a spiral pad in a rush. The top was uneven, and when I opened it, I saw pencil marks, faint and slightly smudged, like the paper had been carried for a while before it found its place in my purse. There was no greeting, no date, just a handful of words, shaky and small, pressed into the paper with the kind of care only a child gives to something that matters. And as I read it, sitting in that quiet space behind a table full of voices, I felt every single letter settle into my bones. Grandma, I love when you're around. You're the only one who listens. Please don't stop being you. My hands went still. The sounds of forks tapping and glasses being raised faded into the distance. I could still see them laughing, talking, moving their hands in the air to tell stories I wasn't part of. But inside me, everything had stopped. My breath, my hurt, my quiet aching, it all stood still in the echo of those words. He hadn't needed to say much. He never did. Just that small note, hidden like a secret offering, told me more than any adult at that table ever could. It wasn't written with big words or perfect grammar. It didn't try to fix anything. It simply told the truth. A truth I hadn't dared to say out loud. That I mattered. That I was still seen. That someone in all that noise had listened too. One note. Folded. Quiet. Small. And yet somehow louder than her whisper had been. Louder than all the polite smiles and careful sentences in that polished room. Louder than silence. Loud enough to wake something in me that had been sitting still for too long. I sat there holding that little piece of paper, folding it gently back along the creases, smoothing it with the tips of my fingers, like it was made of something far more delicate than lined notebook paper. My hand trembled a bit, not from anger, not even sadness anymore, but from the weight of knowing I had been handed something real in a room full of things that only looked like truth. I slipped the note back into my purse slowly, careful not to crumple it, as if it might one day need to be read again. Maybe not by me, but by someone who would need to know what was once said in a whisper. Only paper could keep. I could have stayed quiet. I almost did. For a long moment I sat there, torn between peace and presence. I thought about keeping my head down, waiting for the dinner to end, thanking her for the invitation, hugging her son gently, and leaving without a sound. I knew how to do that. I had done that kind of leaving before, the kind where you carry your dignity in silence, where you nod and smile and pretend your heart isn't being stepped on softly under the table. I had mastered that art. But something shifted that night. Maybe it was the way my name hadn't been spoken once since I arrived. Maybe it was the way no one noticed when I stopped eating. Or maybe it was simply that note, that handful of truth, slipped into my hands by someone who still knew how to see with their heart. I looked up from my plate and scanned the room slowly. The polished nails tapping against wine glasses. The designer watches catching the chandelier light. The laughter that knew when to rise and when to fall, like music rehearsed in a room I hadn't been invited to conduct. I saw women adjusting their earrings and men checking their phones under the table. I saw stories being told with large gestures and polite smiles, names being dropped, vacation homes mentioned, deals hinted at. And in the middle of all that, I saw myself. Not as they saw me, old, quiet, someone to place at the edge of the evening. But as I truly was, the woman who raised the girl who hosted this dinner. The hands that once held her through fevers. The voice that once calmed her night terrors. The spine that bent for years just to keep the lights on. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my truth just to keep her comfortable. All the birthdays I made magical with coins I found between couch cushions. All the sacrifices that had no receipt, no applause, no thank you. And now I was being asked, with a whisper, to be less than myself. To act like someone quieter, smaller, easier to forget. But I had been invisible long enough. And that note, that little folded reminder of who I still was, it gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Not courage, not pride, something simpler. Permission to speak, to stand, to no longer disappear quietly for the comfort of others. So I sat up a little straighter. I placed my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. I took one last look around the room, not in judgment, not in bitterness, but with clarity. I didn't need them to see me. I needed to see myself. And I did. I pushed my chair back slowly, careful not to let it scrape too loud against the floor. The sound still turned a few heads, just for a moment, but most went back to their desserts, to their half-finished stories and half-hearted laughter. I stood up, steadying myself with one hand on the back of the chair. I didn't rush. I didn't fumble. I reached into my purse and unfolded the note again, the one I'd smoothed so carefully just moments earlier. My fingers knew exactly where to find it, like it had always been waiting for its moment. I looked down the length of the table. The soft flicker of candlelight danced on the silver, and conversations were still floating in little bubbles all around. I cleared my throat gently. Not loud, not forced. Just enough to pull the room's attention toward the quiet they hadn't noticed until it spoke. A few heads turned again, slower this time, eyebrows lifted in polite curiosity. No one spoke. No one moved. And then I began to read. Grandma, I love when you're around. You're the only one who listens. Please don't stop being you. That was all I said. Just those words. No introduction, no explanation. Just the letter. Word for word, truth for truth. The sound of my voice was soft but steady. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. His truth was louder than anything I could have added. Louder than the clink of glasses or the rattle of nervous laughter. Louder than the silence that came next, when the room realized something real had just landed in the middle of their polished evening. I heard it first, a small gasp, barely a sound, followed by the faint clatter of silver. One man across the table dropped his spoon onto his plate, and the sound echoed more than it should have. A few guests shifted in their chairs. One woman looked down into her wine glass like it had asked her a question she didn't want to answer. Another couple glanced at each other quickly, then away, their smiles forgotten. But I didn't watch them. I looked at her. My daughter. She had frozen in her seat, her back straight, her fork hovering just above the edge of her plate. Her eyes had gone wide, not in shock, but in exposure. She wasn't confused. She knew what the note meant. She knew where it came from. And most of all, she knew it had come from the one person in that house whose eyes still saw me without judgment. Her face didn't crumble, not yet. But the mask she wore, the carefully practiced smile, the measured tone, the performer's calm, it cracked. Not with a scream, not with tears, but with silence. The kind of silence that comes when you realize something true has entered the room, and you're the only one pretending it doesn't belong. I didn't look at her for long. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want to win. I just wanted to be heard. So after I read the note, I folded it once more, slowly and with care, and slipped it back into my purse, like it was a piece of my own story I had finally reclaimed. And then, just as quietly as I had stood, I turned and walked away from the table, the warmth of the letter still in my hands, and the sound of truth still hanging in the air behind me. Before I left the table, I gave her one last look. Not harsh, not cold, just clear. The kind of look that doesn't need volume to be heard. Her eyes met mine for a second, and I could see everything she didn't say. The flicker of discomfort, the stiff line of her mouth, the way her hand clenched the napkin in her lap. She didn't speak. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe the truth once spoken out loud had taken all the air from her side of the table. And I said it, calmly, clearly. You said I was embarrassing. But to him, I'm everything. I didn't rush the words. I let them settle in the space between us, not as a weapon but as a reminder, not just to her, but to myself. A reminder that even if the world forgets you, even if your own child forgets the nights you held her close while she cried, or the mornings you woke up early just to keep her warm and fed, there's always someone who remembers. Someone who sees not just what you've done, but who you are. And in his small, quiet way, he reminded me that I was still worth being. After that, I didn't wait for permission. I didn't need applause. I didn't stay to see if anyone clapped or gasped or whispered about me once I was gone. I just gathered my things, my shawl from the back of the chair, my purse still carrying that folded note like a treasure map. I pushed my chair back in, the legs barely making a sound against the floor. My hands were steady now. My steps were soft but certain. No slammed doors, no dramatic speeches, no anger thrown across the room like a storm. Just the quiet movement of a woman who remembered who she was and decided not to sit in a space where that truth was treated like clutter. I didn't glance back as I walked toward the door. There was nothing behind me I needed to see. The people who mattered would find their way to me when the noise faded. And those who didn't, well, they had already shown me who they were, long before I stood up from that chair. I stepped out into the night air, crisp and clean, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light. Not empty, just free. Because sometimes, reclaiming your place doesn't mean fighting. It just means standing and walking, and not apologizing for either one. The next morning, the house was still. The kind of stillness that lingers after something honest has been spoken. No messages, no calls, no apologies, just silence, stretched thin across the hours like a curtain pulled shut. I didn't expect a thank you. I didn't even expect a reply. But I suppose, somewhere in the part of me that still remembered holding her hand on her first day of school, I hoped for something. A line, a breath, something softer than silence. But the silence stayed. It was a week before I heard anything. A single text, plain as paper and twice as thin. It read, "You didn't have to make a scene." No greeting, no warmth, just that. As if truth was a disruption. As if standing tall just once had tilted the room too far. I read it twice, then once more. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Perfectly. And I replied only once. I didn't make a scene. I made a stand. I didn't wait for a reply. There wasn't one. Sometimes people answer your truth with silence because they're still trying to undo the mirror you held up to them. I let it rest. I didn't carry it. I had already carried enough. That weekend, there was a knock at my door. Not loud, just 2 soft taps. When I opened it, there he was. Her son. My grandson. No coat. Just a backpack slung over his shoulder and a smile that didn't ask for anything. He didn't say much, just stepped in and wrapped his arms around me, like the note was still pressed between us. I had already started something in the oven. Bread. The kind that fills the house with a smell that feels like memory. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where we'd worked on school projects and made snowflake cutouts in December. We didn't talk about the dinner. We didn't have to. Children remember things not just by what is said, but by what is felt. And he had felt everything that night, just like I had. We talked about books, about the science project he had coming up, about how he hated raisins in cookies but liked them in cereal. And somewhere between checking the oven and stirring the honey butter, he looked at me with those same quiet eyes and asked, "Will you always be my grandma, even when I grow up?" I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it caught me by the heart, in a way that made the moment bigger than the room. I knelt beside him, placed my hand on his, and said, "Especially then. Because when the world tries to make you smaller, the ones who see you clearly will always find their way back. Not through fancy invitations or rehearsed smiles, but through small notes, shared bread, and questions that carry more love than some grown-ups ever learn how to give." There's a kind of ache that doesn't come all at once. It settles in slowly over the years, like dust on a shelf no one reaches for anymore. You don't feel it until one day someone forgets to call you by your name or leaves you off the invitation list or pats your hand gently and changes the subject when you speak. And then you realize it's already been there. The fading. The soft dismissal. The shrinking of your voice in rooms where you once stood tall. Motherhood, for me, was never about perfection. It was about presence. I didn't always have the right words, but I always had the right intention. I didn't always have enough money, but I made enough of what mattered. I gave time, care, belief, over and over, without needing a receipt to prove it. I watched her grow with pride. I stood behind her when she stumbled. I stayed beside her when the world turned cold. And somewhere along the way, when life got busy and success came dressed in heels and schedules, she forgot who raised her. But he didn't forget. He remembered who held him on the nights he couldn't sleep, who saved the last slice of cake, who never rushed his thoughts, never brushed off his feelings. He remembered what it felt like to be seen without being managed. He saw me, not as an old woman at the edge of the room, but as the same steady presence that had always made him feel safe. One small note, hidden between paper and quiet, told me everything I needed to know. That I still mattered, that I was still someone's home. There's this idea in the world, especially now, that age is something to manage, not honor. That if you're not fast or tech-savvy or Instagram-ready, you've somehow outlived your usefulness. We're erased softly with polite words and well-meaning phrases like, "You just rest," or "Let the younger ones handle it." Invitations come less often. Decisions are made without asking. Rooms grow quieter when you enter, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. And they don't even see it happening. But I see it. And to anyone listening who has felt that, who has sat quietly while others talked over the life you lived, who has been spoken to like a child by someone you once tucked in at night, hear me clearly. You are not disposable. You are not a prop. You are not something to be managed or explained away. You are the roots, the reason the tree stands at all. Without your sacrifices, your sleepless nights, your wisdom, your resilience, there would be no legacy to gather around these polished tables. They don't always say thank you. They may never fully understand what you gave, but that doesn't erase the truth of what you did, of who you are. And while some may forget, there are always those who remember in quiet ways. A look, a hug, a note folded into your purse when the room isn't watching. So, if you've ever felt pushed aside, if you've ever been made to feel like you were taking up space in the life you helped build, know this. You belong, and you don't need to earn your place twice. You already did the work. You already paid the price. You are the reason they have a seat at the table at all. It only takes a whisper to wound you, and mine came from the one I once carried in my arms. But it also only takes a small truth to lift you back up. A folded note, written in pencil, slipped quietly into a purse no one thought to check. That night I wasn't loud. I didn't need to be. I stood up not to shame her, but to remember myself. To remind the room and my own heart that I still belonged. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't trying to make a moment. I simply chose not to disappear. I chose to be seen. And in that choice I found something I thought I had lost. Not power, not control, just clarity. If you've ever been silenced by someone you raised, tell me below. Or just write, I remembered my name. That's enough. Please subscribe if you've ever been told you were too much and chose to be exactly enough. And if you're watching this alone tonight, this voice, it's for you. See you on the next video.